The Beetle by Richard Marsh. Chapter 33. What came of looking through a lattice? He began in accents which halted not a little. By degrees his voice grew firmer. Words came from him with greater fluency. I am not yet 40, so when I tell you that 20 years ago I was a mere youth, I am stating what is a sufficiently obvious truth. It is 20 years ago since the events of which I am going to speak transpired. I lost both my parents when I was quite a lad, and by their death I was left in a position in which I was, to an unusual extent in one so young, my own master. I was ever of a rambling turn of mind, and when at the mature age of 18 I left school, I decided that I should learn more from travel than from sojourn at a university. So, since there was no one to say me nay, instead of going either to Oxford or Cambridge, I went abroad. After a few months I found myself in Egypt. I was down with fever at Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo. I had caught it by drinking polluted water during an excursion with some Bedouins to Palmyra. When the fever had left me I went out one night into the town in search of amusement. I went unaccompanied, into the native quarter, not a wise thing to do, especially at night, but at 18 one is not always wise, and I was weary of the monotony of the sick room, and eager for something which had in it a spice of adventure. I found myself in a street which I have reason to believe is no longer existing. It had a French name, and was called the Rue de Rabagas. I saw the name on the corner as I turned into it, and it has left an impress on the tablets of my memory which is never likely to be obliterated. It was a narrow street, and, of course, a dirty one, ill-lit, and apparently, at the moment of my appearance, deserted. I had gone down, perhaps half-way down its tortuous length, blundering more than once into the kennel, wondering what fantastic whim had brought me into such unsavoury quarters, and what would happen to me if, as seemed extremely possible, I lost my way. On a sudden my ears were saluted by sounds which proceeded from a house which I was passing, sounds of music and of singing. I paused. I stood a while to listen. There was an open window on my right, which was screened by latticed blinds. From the room which was behind these blinds the sounds were coming. Someone was singing, accompanied by an instrument resembling a guitar, singing uncommonly well. Mr Lessingham stopped. A stream of recollection seemed to come flooding over him. A dreamy look came into his eyes. I remember it all as clearly as if it were yesterday. How it all comes back, the dirty street, the evil smells, the imperfect light, the girl's voice filling all at once the air. It was a girl's voice, full and round and sweet, an organ seldom met with, especially in such a place as that. She sang a little chansonnette, which, just then, half Europe was humming. It occurred in an opera which they were acting at one of the boulevard theatres, La Petite Voyageuse. The effect, coming so unexpectedly, was startling. I stood and heard her to an end. Inspired by I know not what impulse of curiosity, when the song was finished, I moved one of the lattice blinds a little aside so as to enable me to get a glimpse of the singer. I found myself looking into what seemed to be a sort of café, one of those places which were found all over the continent, in which women sing in order to attract custom. There was a low platform at one end of the room, and on it were seated 3 women. One of them had evidently just been accompanying her own song. She still had an instrument of music in her hands, and was striking a few idle notes. The other 2 had been acting as audience. They were attired in the fantastic apparel which the women who are found in such places generally wear. An old woman was sitting knitting in a corner, whom I took to be the inevitable patronne. With the exception of these 4, the place was empty. They must have heard me touch the lattice, or seen it moving, for no sooner did I glance within than the 3 pairs of eyes on the platform were raised and fixed on mine. The old woman in the corner alone showed no consciousness of my neighbourhood. We eyed one another in silence for a second or two. Then the girl with the harp, the instrument she was manipulating proved to be fashioned more like a harp than a guitar, called out to me. "Entrez, monsieur. Soyez le bienvenu." I was a little tired, rather curious as to whereabouts I was. The place struck me, even at that first momentary glimpse, as hardly in the ordinary line of that kind of thing. and not unwilling to listen to a repetition of the former song, or to another sung by the same singer. 'On condition,' I replied, 'that you sing me another song.' 'Ah, monsieur, with the greatest pleasure in the world I will sing you 20. She was almost, if not quite as good as her word. She entertained me with song after song. I may safely say that I have seldom, if ever, heard melody more enchanting. All languages seemed to be the same to her. She sang in French and Italian, German and English, in tongues with which I was unfamiliar. It was in these Eastern harmonies that she was most successful. They were indescribably weird and thrilling, and she delivered them with a verve and sweetness which was amazing. I sat at one of the little tables with which the room was dotted, listening entranced. Time passed more rapidly than I supposed. While she sang I sipped the liqueur with which the old woman had supplied me. So enthralled was I by the display of the girl's astonishing gifts that I did not notice what it was I was drinking. Looking back, I can only surmise that it was some poisonous concoction of the creature's own. That one small glass had on me the strangest effect. I was still weak from the fever which I had only just succeeded in shaking off, and that, no doubt, had something to do with the result. But, as I continued to sit, I was conscious that I was sinking into a lethargic condition, against which I was incapable of struggling. After a while the original performer ceased her efforts, and, her companions taking her place, she came and joined me at the little table. Looking at my watch I was surprised to perceive the lateness of the hour. I rose to leave. She caught me by the wrist. 'Do not go,' she said. She spoke English of a sort, and with the queerest accent. 'All is well with you, rest a while.' You will smile. I should smile, perhaps, were I the listener instead of you. But it is the simple truth that her touch had on me what I can only describe as a magnetic influence. As her fingers closed upon my wrist I felt as powerless in her grasp as if she held me with bands of steel. What seemed an invitation was virtually a command. I had to stay whether I would or wouldn't. She called for more liquor, and at what again was really her command I drank of it. I do not think that after she touched my wrist I uttered a word. She did all the talking, and while she talked she kept her eyes fixed on my face. Those eyes of hers! They were a devil's. I can positively affirm that they had on me a diabolical effect. They robbed me of my consciousness, of my power of volition, of my capacity to think. They made me as wax in her hands. My last recollection of that fatal night is of her sitting in front of me, bending over the table, stroking my wrist with her extended fingers, staring at me with her awful eyes. After that, a curtain seems to descend. There comes a period of oblivion. Mr Lessingham ceased. His manner was calm and self-contained enough, but in spite of that I could see that the mere recollection of the things which he told me moved his nature to its foundations. There was eloquence in the drawn lines about his mouth, and in the strained expression of his eyes. So far his tale was sufficiently commonplace. Places such as the one which he described abound in the Cairo of to-day, and many are the Englishmen who have entered them to their exceeding bitter cost. With that keen intuition which has done him yeoman's service in the political arena, Mr Lessingham at once perceived the direction my thoughts were taking. 'You've heard this tale before?' 'No doubt, and often. The traps are many, and the fools and the unwary are not a few. The singularity of my experience is still to come. You must forgive me if I seem to stumble in the telling. I am anxious to present my case as baldly, and with as little appearance of exaggeration as possible. I say with as little appearance, for some appearance of exaggeration I fear is unavoidable. My case is so unique, and so out of the common run of our everyday experience, that the plainest possible statement must smack of the sensational. As I fancy you have guessed, when understanding returned to me I found myself in an apartment with which I was unfamiliar. I was lying, undressed, on a heap of rugs in a corner of a low-pitched room which was furnished in a fashion which, when I grasped the details, filled me with amazement. By my side knelt the woman of the songs. Leaning over she wooed my mouth with kisses. I cannot describe to you the sense of horror and of loathing with which the contact of her lips oppressed me. There was about her something so unnatural, so inhuman that I believe even then I could have destroyed her with as little sense of moral turpitude